We're back here on the radio program. And the news out of North Korea, well, it continues to be concerning, I think it's fair to say. China says they support UN action on North Korea. Putin says the problem there can't really be solved. There's a lot of different issues that are happening in that country right now. And someone who keeps a close eye on that is Elliot Tepper. And Elliot Tepper is a distinguished senior fellow with the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, also a senior research fellow with the Center for Security, Intelligence, Defense Studies at Carleton, and joins on the phone lines to have a conversation about what's going on in North Korea right now. Good morning. Thank you very much for the time on the program today. I appreciate it.
Certainly, Craig. Good morning to you.
So first I want to talk about these Putin comments, and we can go from there. He says that this is something that can't really be solved. Essentially, it's impossible to solve. What are your thoughts on what Vladimir Putin has to say about that?
Well, a few things. One is that, among other things, this means that Putin now sees himself as a player in what until now has been primarily an East Asia-U.S. relationship. Russia has legitimate interest there. They have a border. Is it really an unsolvable problem? And that does seem to sum up a lot of people's attitude. Clearly, we do not see here a military option because of all the obvious things. Seoul is, basically he's summing up a consensus view as well as a Russian view, and he doesn't want war there. But, the military option is really apparently not viable because conventional weapons alone by North Korea can wreak havoc on South Korea and Seoul, and that includes a lot of Americans who are there. This is essentially what General Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis, has said. It would be catastrophic to launch a military strike. And therefore, diplomacy is a way to go, but so far nobody on the North Korean side, and perhaps wider, is willing. So without the North Koreans saying, yes, we want to negotiate, and there seems to be no way to bring them there without a military option, we're back on sanctions and diplomacy. And that's what a lot of people are pointing to, including Mr. Putin.
Right, and I know that the President of the United States is talking about sanctions as well. Is that really what the rest of the world can do, is just try to, like you said, sanctions, diplomacy? I guess there really is no other way as far as trying to reason with the North Korean regime.
We are all left with great uncertainty as to the intentions of the North Korean regime. We know, broadly speaking, they want regime survival. They want the nuclear weapon in their arsenal as a deterrent. They see this as a way to stop being attacked, and that's what everybody is saying. But they also then can use it as a way to bully their neighbor. They can then emerge as more of a regional power. They can say to the United States, really, do you want to sacrifice Chicago and Washington just because we have a dispute with South Korea? So they could, and Japan. So they could be using this in a way to enhance their geostrategic relations, not just as a deterrent. And that's a concern for China, as well as everybody in the neighborhood, probably Russia included.
That's interesting to note as far as the Russian concerns, just because, they typically operate thinking about their concerns and their concerns alone. You mentioned the regime survival thing, and this is just the way that I consider this, and maybe I'm applying too much logic to the situation. But if all they're looking for, if their main goal is regime survival, if that's what the North Korean regime wants, using nuclear weapons in any way, shape, or form seems to be quite counterintuitive to that, right? Because then the world would have to step up and do something, and they would be in a real bad spot if that was the case.
Well, this is what in political science we call a classic security dilemma. Yes, they clearly are trying to gain a weapon they can't use, but they want to deter anybody else from attacking them. But any attempt at defense by one side looks like a potential offense by the other, and then you're into a negative cycle and perhaps an escalation. So they already have a lot of protection because of the conventional weapons that they have. In addition, they also have chemical and biological weapons they could use in their own neighborhood. So this is a real concern. We are in what looks like an imponderable situation where some kind of dialogue is going to be required. The question is how to get there. We have to assume that there's already back channel going on. This is maybe more hope than analysis, but we have to assume that the back channels which are there. Remember, Canada, in the midst of all this, sent the Prime Minister's advisor on security and intelligence right into North Korea, negotiated the release of Pastor Lim, a Canadian Korean dual citizen, North Korean dual citizen, successfully. So there is a way to get in and talk. But right now, if the North Koreans want to become impregnable in their military, in their nuclear strategy before they're willing to talk, then the timing for talks just haven't arrived.
And that's an interesting thing as far as what the time of this is going to be, because right now we've got a situation where there's a lot of people in the world who are more than a little bit on edge as far as what's going on in North Korea. And you would think that having some sort of conversation with them would put a lot of minds at ease. But it's sensitive, and I'm sure it's difficult to wrap your minds around for some of the other nations that are not too far from there when they're thinking to themselves, we don't want to necessarily upset the apple cart. Right now, they don't appear to be poised to use these weapons on anyone anytime soon. So why would we want to start messing around with that situation?
Well, yes, we are in a very tense situation that looks like it's actually kind of pre-crisis crisis. We're not yet in a Cuban Missile Standoff situation. We see no massive signs of the movement of military supplies. There's not been a repositioning of people. It's interesting, as a footnote, Japan is apparently laying ground for the withdrawal of the Japanese citizens from South Korea. They've got something like 60,000 people who are Japanese citizens there, and they are looking at Busan as the port, which is the logical place to extract their personnel in case of a crisis. So it's perhaps normal in a crisis situation to plan ahead for withdrawal. But as a footnote to that, we should remind ourselves quite what's going on here. Canada has been a partner with Korea since 1952. In Busan, there's a cemetery with 519 Canadian soldiers, personnel, who are buried there permanently as a leftover from that Korean War. So we have a partner there, and a partner in democracy as well. The concern right now is, as all of this is going on and nobody can immediately find a way out, I have two broad concerns. The first is what everybody's been talking about, and I've been talking about for a very long time. When you have all this firepower and leading up to a potential crisis, the possibility of miscalculation is very high. We've got a high-stakes game of chicken going on, and if somebody says, well, I can do this and get away with it, but the other side said, no, you've just crossed my red line, that's an issue. There's also the issue of mistake. A nervous soldier, an errant missile, almost any spark in a tinderbox can lead to a war that at the moment nobody actually wants. So that's one of my concerns. Another one, Craig, this is not getting sufficient attention, is weakening of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, weakening the barriers to the widening use or widening availability in our world of the ultimate weapon, of nuclear weapons. 191 countries have signed the NPT. North Korea was actually a member. They pulled out after their first nuclear test. There is a consensus and an institutional barrier, a norm against the spread of nuclear weapons, and that's being weakened by this. Right now, South Korea has to consider, if North Korea is going to get nuclear weapons and nobody's doing anything about it, we have to. And even in Japan of all places, at the very fringes at the minute, there are voices saying, we have to consider this. What about Vietnam? What about North Korea leaking, selling, because they really need money, Craig. Mm-hmm. They'll sell anything to anybody on the black market, and that's a concern for non-state actors as well as other states that want to go nuclear. So my concern here is the weakening of the NPT and our barrier against nuclear weapons generally, along with miscalculation and mistake.
That seems like some pretty legitimate worries, and it doesn't fill you with a lot of confidence as far as what they're going to be up to. As you mentioned, miscalculations and mistakes, and you explained it quite well, but it doesn't fill you with a lot of confidence when you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's something that might happen here or is very much on the table.
I think we're in the realm of hope rather than solid. I don't have information, but the analytical side of this says that logically there's going to be a moment when the various powers involved, and that most definitely includes China, specifically China, but the United States, one thing that China has said that didn't get picked up on as well, saying because they've been saying, like everybody, oh, we need a diplomatic way out. China is chair of the six-party talks. These were talks with all the players, North and South Korea, the U.S., China, etc. All the key players, the EU was there as well. All the key players involved, Russia, were having a series of talks earlier that have not been held in quite some time because they weren't going anywhere. And North Korea is carrying on with or without these talks. As part of a possible solution, China is now floating the idea that they, as chair of the six-party talks, although they have emphasized that part, that's one venue as a possible way of getting talks underway. And we have to remind ourselves that China, as chair, has been a failure. China, as the major patron of North Korea, and they can maybe rein them in, has been a failure. They also have wider ambitions. China sees North Korea as just one element of their wider ambition to sooner they hope, push America out of certainly the region and perhaps elsewhere. But they want to be the power in Asia, and North Korea is doing nothing but bringing the United States more and more back into Asia, more and more committed to Asia. Therefore, they're a barrier to China's ambitions.
It just there's so much going on here that doesn't even necessarily involve North Korea. I want to just get back to the United States angle on this before we go, because we hear all the time about the unpredictability of the North Korean regime. There's a little bit of an element of unpredictability with the government in the United States right now.
Indeed.
How does that impact things here?
Well, we opened up with Putin.
Same deal.
He said, "Look, these North Koreans are trying to provoke you. Why are you falling in line? Why are you reacting to the provocation? Mm-hmm. Basically, why are you being a sucker?" He didn't put it that way. But yes, the uncertainty about the United States with the additional element of a Donald Trump and his tweets does add we can be optimistic and say what this really does is keep everybody more pushed in the direction of we'd better solve this before the president does something. But that's, again, in the realm of hope. The unpredictability of Donald Trump is certainly a factor. One of the things that plays into this is right now, in the midst of all this crisis, he's dissing South Korea. He's basically distancing himself from the key ally, South Korea, first by calling them. Did you follow that? Appeasement?
Yeah.
Appeasement? What a loaded term. And then he's saying, oh, by the way, we have a free trade agreement. We don't like free trade agreements generally, like, NAFTA, but we're going to terminate this free trade agreement with South Korea. So picking disputes with your primary ally in this particular crisis at this particular time is just baffling.
Yeah, I don't get it. Here's one of the things that the president tweeted. This is earlier, a couple of days ago. South Korea is finding, as I have told them, that their talk of appeasement with North Korea will not work. They only understand one thing! ! Because that's what he always ends the tweets with.
Yes.
You're right. It just does something like a bizarre way to go about it, needless to say.
Well, and of course, we can then say, just as a sidelight to all this, we're currently renegotiating NAFTA only because of his insistence.
Yeah.
If he's willing to do this to South Korean ally in the middle of a nuclear crisis, what does that mean for us? That's a sidelight, but an important one because NAFTA is critically important to Canada's future. But at a global level, Canada is part of any Western coalition. We've got this long-standing relationship, also with, by the way, a free trade pact with South Korea. So we are part of the equation, and as others have been pointing out, any missiles that fly would fly over Canada.
Right, and then there's that whole miscalculation thing you were just talking about earlier.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's not end on too much of gloom
Sure.
and doom. The possibility at the moment is that what I've been suggesting is that we are in a pre-crisis and kind of pre-negotiation stage. That is, we aren't really seeing a huge buildup of arms, movement of military personnel around. We're not in that situation at the minute, and we are in a situation where likely behind the scenes the preconditions for negotiation are being laid down. So let's hope that as we still have the waning sunshine of summer, that normal rational political processes in international relations, with all the powers around this saying we cannot have a war there, those will prevail.
I hope the very same thing. And I'll knock on wood for that. Professor Tepper, thank you so much for coming on this program. Really glad to have the conversation. Hopefully we'll talk to you again very soon.
Anytime.
All right, thank you. That's Elliot Tepper, and really glad to have that conversation with him. He's an expert in international relations, expert on what's going on in North Korea, and he's a professor at Carleton University. Got to take a break here because that conversation went on longer than I thought it would, but it's so gosh darn interesting. I didn't want to stop it. Victor's probably mad at me. More of the Craig Needle Show after this. You're listening to AM 980.